Hello summoners and welcome to another ProGuides video. I'm Crumbs and I'm here with our 12.7 low ELO tier list. Our regular tier list we post with the patch rundown and mid-patch updates, which are aimed at around high gold to platinum skill level. But we kept moving champs like Jace and Akali up on the list since, when played perfectly, these champs are pretty broken. But the thing is, people in gold play perfectly. That's why we recently made a high ELO tier list to differentiate what's objectively the best when played to near perfection versus a realistic performance in the middle ELOs. And that got us thinking, why not also make a tier list for the lower levels of play too? I know it's tempting to try and lock in what the pros and high ELO streamers play, but trust me, the best thing to do for climbing is acknowledging that sometimes some champs are a bit too hard to pull off until you're better at the game. And conversely, some champs are way better at low levels because your enemies aren't as coordinated or don't have the game knowledge and mechanics needed to counter them. So, with all that said, let's get into this tier list, shall we? First, we'll start off with our top laners. Garen is a really strong pick in the upper ELOs, but most teams also know how to play around him to some extent. So if he ends up being the only one fed on the team, he won't always be a complete wrecking ball if the enemy team has a good comp for kiting him and keeping their backline carry safe. But in these lower ELO games, you're usually able to plow through entire teams without much resistance. That, coupled with the fact that he's one of the easiest champs in the game to play, makes him a total 1v9 warrior at this level of play. So for that reason, he makes it all the way to the OP tier. Another champ that fits that description is Mundo. While their kits don't really look anything alike, they're both champs that can throw their weight around in a similar fashion. Both of them are immobile, yet have good sticking power and can easily 100 to 0 AD carries in the backline when they don't get good peel. So, Mundo also makes the OP tier in gold and under games. Most hyper carries generally come with pretty difficult to use kits, mechanically speaking, and require a long time to come online. As a result, they aren't always the best picks in lower ELOs, but not Kayle, who lands in the OP tier. While she can't hard carry fights until way later in the game, once you get her ranged attacks at level 6, she becomes a pretty decent laner. Most low ELO players struggle really badly against ranged champs and have no idea how to deal with a constant poke. They end up taking stupid trades or just conceding the lane altogether. Your main goal with Kayle is to just plant yourself in the side lane and soak up as much farm as you can until 3 items at level 16. At that point, you'll be able to easily mow down the entire enemy team. Sejuani Top has recently emerged as one of our favorite off-meta picks, so we add her to our list in the A tier. She's super easy to trade with in lane, has good engages for fights, and is a pretty decent damage threat. She falls just barely short of being as reliable as our OP tier tanks. While both Shen and Tahm Kench fit the description that our OP tier tanky champs did of being high damage and super tanky, they both get demoted to the A tier. That's because they're actually decently hard to play, both in the laning phase and later on in the game. Their trading isn't as easy as just run at your foe and press buttons. They require timing your abilities based around what your foe is doing in the fight. Despite Fiora having a super high skill ceiling, her skill floor isn't all that crazy. It definitely helps if you can actually use her W to block an important ability, but when it comes to going in for trades, she's pretty easy to understand and pull off. So, with all that being said, she's being demoted, but only down to the B tier. Poppy's scrappy kit makes her a very strong mix of being a tank and a carry in higher levels of play, but it requires constant pressure on your opponent to maintain a lead. You also need pretty good reaction speed to use her W properly against quick foes. So, while she's a decent counterpick to AD bruisers, she isn't as reliable as the other tanks higher than her on the list. Cassiopeia can be an extremely strong counter to some melee champs, but she requires pretty good mechanics to use and her laning phase is pretty touchy, even in good matchups. So she gets demoted down to the C tier. While Riven is insanely broken in high ELO, being arguably the very best top laner in the game in the hands of a seasoned one-trick, in the lowest levels of play, she is terrible. She requires really good mechanics and understanding of how to play the champ in different matchups, and that's obviously not something you're going to expect down here. She's just the type of champ where even playing her mediocrely results in her being completely useless. You're either going to 1v9 on her, or basically make your team fight a 4v5. So, with all that being said, she ends up in the C tier bordering on being a D tier pick. And Camille is in the exact same boat. When played super well, Camille's kit allows you to lane against most opponents and make big plays later on in the game. She's great at split pushing, making picks, and even engaging fights with her ult. But without really good mechanics to actually combo well with her, she's a total flop and provides next to nothing to a team. You're much better off playing simpler point-and-click type champs or those that rely on auto attacks than someone that requires such precision when you're playing in gold and under. Now for the jungle, here's our list. Being both tanky and high damage in conjunction with being pretty much just a point-and-click champion lands Volibear in the OP tier. People often underestimate how good his dueling is early, since it's pretty easy for lower level players to not take his shield and the heal from his W into account. As a result, people will end up taking you on in fights they can't win and just giving you huge leads you don't even have to work for. He then becomes a big force in fights, giving you both engage and a backline threat that can easily 100-0 squishy carries in seconds. Surprising to nobody, Master Yi also gets bumped up to the OP tier list in low elo. He's just the ultimate AFK farm and roll team fights. Contrary to what most people think, Yi does actually have a pretty high skill cap. There's definitely a difference between a good Yi and the average Yi player. With that said, he is guilty of having a really low skill floor too. If you just spam Q and E on cooldown and right click hard enough, he's one of the easiest champs to wipe the entire enemy team with. Shyvana and Warwick don't really seem anything alike, but both champions do very well in the lower levels of play for the same reasons. They have healthy clears, both champs can solo dragon, and later on in the fights, they're super tanky, but also do plenty of damage, so they can be huge solo threats to enemy carries. They're also both champs that can deal with split pushers pretty easily, so when you have teammates that run around like chickens with their heads cut off, which is fairly common, you can go deal with that enemy in the side lane yourself. Kha'Zix and Talon are both pretty low risk, high reward picks at the upper levels of play, but that's because even when not fed, higher elo players know how to effectively combo, weave in and out of fights, and cleanly bring down targets. Lower elo players don't quite have the finesse to pull that off, so they both drop down to the B tier at this level of play. While he does have scaling on his side, the complete lack of early game presence and requiring decent vision control to actually land big ults puts Fiddle down to the B tier in lower elo. Kindred is an incredibly strong hyper carry when you path well with her to get marks and avoid bad fights early. But if you don't have the deep game knowledge you need to consistently do that in the early game every time, you're not gonna get the results you want to see with her. And that is the case pretty often with her in lower elos, so we're placing her in the C tier. The lower in elo you go, the more games drag out. So champs that do well early but fall off hard as the game goes on tend to be a lot worse as you start looking lower and lower in the ranks. And that's why we're demoting Rek'Sai and Elise all the way down to the C tier. Most players here don't really grasp how to play the early game on a high tempo, perma-ganking jungler in the first place, much less use that type of lead to win by 15 minutes. Here's our mid lane tier list. Akshan drops down to the A tier at this level of play. He's still good and can win most lanes here, but people don't really have the auto spacing and kiting ability to really maximize their bullying. Plus, they usually don't take advantage of his roaming very well. Cassiopeia lands herself in the B tier for mid lane. The only reason she doesn't end up in the C tier like she did for top is because most matchups aren't quite as volatile in mid, and the shorter the lane, the safer it is, so you aren't as easily punished for mistakes. For years, everyone saw Tryndamere as the low elo pub stomper and a champ that is completely unviable at higher levels of play, but somehow we've reached the point where the script has totally flipped. He's one of the most whined about champs in solo lanes at the top of the ladder, but is barely worth picking in lower elo, so we put him in the B tier. Due to him being a champion that almost entirely revolves around macro and team play, Twisted Fate drops all the way down to the C tier for low elo. Zed, Katarina, and Qiyana all drop to the C tier. In high elo, with super clean mechanics, this trio of assassins are a menace. They can burst people down from full even in the early game and can snowball wildly out of control. But with much lower mechanical skill, lower elo players rarely stomp lane like they need to do well, and even when they do snowball, they often fail to convert that into a win. Now let's move things down to the bot lane. You may have expected Vayne to be lower than our other tier lists here, since she has a pretty high skill ceiling. But the thing is, her skill floor is surprisingly pretty low. Even if you just stand still autoing, she does insane damage and can melt divers. So she's actually the very best marksman in the lower levels of play, since you often won't be getting help dealing with those threats jumping on you in fights. Since poke champs are more effective at lower levels of play where teams are less able to coordinate and pull the trigger on fights, Sivir gets bumped up to the A tier and could almost be considered an S tier pick. Lucian has recently become one of the best bot lane picks at upper levels of play, as he usually does when big blanket nerfs get handed out to the marksman class as a whole. That said, this skill floor to make Lucian an effective pick is pretty high, so he's not a champ that does that great in lower elos, so we're putting him in the B tier for this list. Kai'Sa is in a pretty similar spot to Lucian. She may be able to pump out pretty decent DPS, but it doesn't compare to hyper carries like Jinx, Kog'Maw, or Twitch, and she has to work a lot harder to do her maximum amount of damage. To finish things off, we have our supports. Renata falls down to the A tier at this level of play. Just spamming her abilities, she still has pretty good impact in fights, but she won't seem nearly as OP as she does in the higher levels, where players are more patient and land much more effective Ws and ults. Xerath moves up to the A tier. In lower levels of play where people are much more prone to tilting and don't know how to deal with poke very well, Xerath's extreme range can be enough to win the game by the end of the laning phase alone. It's not an exaggeration to say that you may make the enemy AD carry rage quit before the enemy team even gets a chance to teamfight. While Senna, played to perfection, is an insanely disgusting carry, lower skilled players don't really understand how to efficiently farm souls well enough to actually reach that point. So there's a huge difference between coming out of laning phase 60 plus souls and coming out of it with 20. So she belongs in the B tier and is pretty close to being considered lower than that. Rel is a pretty good champ for countering teams that have hard engage, but she's also relatively difficult to play. Aside from how hard she is to pilot, she also requires a team that understands what she does and can coordinate with that well. So she drops to the B tier for low elo. And that about wrapped things up for our 12.7 low elo tier list. I hope you enjoyed the video. Since making this list involved going over all the champs and all the roles, I'm sure we overlooked a pick here or there, so feel free to let us know if you think we missed something down in the comments below. And one last thing, don't forget to check out our Discord in the description box where you can discuss League further or just hang out and be a part of our community. I can't wait to see you guys back for the next video, but until then, good luck on the Rift and may the LP God smile down upon you.